Once Europe's most powerful leader, Napoleon Bonaparte ended his days on a lonely South Atlantic island. He died in 1821, convinced that his British captors were slowly killing him. In 1978, a sensational new accusation revived an old question: was Napoleon murdered by one of his own French companions? I die prematurely, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin. 3 weeks before his death on May 5, 1821, Napoleon added those words to his last will and testament. Sitting upright in bed, using a piece of cardboard as a makeshift desk, the desperately ill former emperor painstakingly copied the passage in his own hand, careful that even his notoriously illegible handwriting could be understood. The sentence was both a reproach to the nation that had exiled him to Saint Helena and a direct accusation against the island's governor, Hudson Lowe. The afternoon after Napoleon died, 7 British doctors gathered at his residence while his personal physician, Francesco Annamarchi, performed a 2-hour autopsy. 6 of the British doctors were military men and therefore subject to Governor Lowe. Although they did not yet know the contents of Napoleon's will, they were fully aware that the death of such a man could ignite international controversy. Unable to agree on what they had found, the doctors submitted 4 separate reports. Annamarchi concluded that Napoleon died of a cancerous ulcer of the stomach, and his conclusion became the one generally accepted. When the news reached Europe, there was a collective sigh of relief. The man who had dominated the continent for a quarter century was finally gone. Napoleon's accusation, later divulged, was dismissed as the vengeful paranoia of a dying man. In the years after his death, innumerable books about Napoleon appeared, including memoirs by several people who had shared his exile on Saint Helena. The last major first-hand account of the emperor's final years was the autobiography of his devoted valet, Louis Marchand, written for his daughter to show you and later your children what the emperor was for me, and published by a grandson in 1955. That book fell into the hands of Sven Forshuffvad, a Swedish dentist and toxicologist, a specialist in the study of poisons and an admiring student of Napoleon's career. Many historians had questioned the official version of Napoleon's death, but none had produced sufficient evidence to truly challenge it. Marchand's memoirs, Forshuffvad came to believe, contained clues that pointed to poisoning. His investigation took him across Europe, to North America, and even to Saint Helena. And in 1978, 157 years after Napoleon's death, Forshuffvad published his explosive claim: Napoleon had been the victim of arsenic poisoning. The murderer, he argued, was not Hudson Lowe, the English governor Napoleon despised, but someone inside the emperor's own household, a French companion in exile. After conquering most of Europe, Napoleon unwisely invaded Russia in June 1812, and was forced into a humiliating retreat that cost him 500,000 men. An alliance of his enemies turned on France and forced his abdication in April 1814. A year later he escaped exile on Elba, but his attempt to regain power ended in a final crushing defeat at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, and a second abdication. Hoping for asylum in England, Napoleon surrendered to his most persistent foes, the British. Instead, he was placed aboard a warship for the long voyage to Saint Helena, what the furious ex-emperor called a death sentence. The remains of an extinct volcano, Saint Helena is a 47-square-mile island, 15 degrees south of the equator, and 1,200 miles from the west coast of Africa. Discovered by the Portuguese, it had later been granted to the British East India Company as a water supply stop for vessels traveling to and from India. Its population of about 4,000 included a garrison of 1,000, and the force sent to guard Napoleon would eventually triple the number of troops on the island. Seeing it for the first time on October 15, a British doctor aboard Napoleon's ship described Saint Helena as the ugliest and most dismal rock conceivable, rising like an enormous black wart from the face of the deep. Napoleon was allowed to take a small entourage into exile, including Henry Gratian Bertrand, the former Grand Marshal of his palace, and Count Charles Tristan de Montholon, a member of the pre-revolutionary aristocracy. Bertrand had served at Napoleon's side since 1798. Montholon, by contrast, was a more recent adherent, one who had hurried to offer his services to the restored monarchy after Napoleon's first abdication, then switched sides again when the emperor returned from Elba. Montholon brought with him his attractive young wife, whose attentions to Napoleon and post-midnight visits to his room soon became the subject of island gossip. The group initially lived in a local merchant's garden house until Longwood House, a 23-room yellow stucco villa, could be made ready. Situated on an upland plateau some miles from Saint Helena's port, Longwood was bleak and unhealthy, its walls covered in green mold and its rooms infested with rats. The daily routine offered little variety. Napoleon spent hours dictating memoirs or retracing his military exploits over maps and globes in what had once been a billiard room. After dinner, the exiles played cards and chess, or listened as the former emperor read aloud until he would abruptly announce that it was time for bed. One attendant famously described the week as boredom from Monday through Saturday and great boredom on Sunday. Major General Sir Hudson Lowe arrived on St. Helena on April 14, 1816. As governor, he was effectively Napoleon's jailer, known for indecision and frequent changes of mind. Lowe was characterized by a former commander as wanting in education and judgment, stupid, suspicious and jealous. Napoleon disliked him instantly, remarking that Lowe had a most villainous face. Lowe meanwhile seemed terrified that his famous prisoner might escape. He imposed severe restrictions on Napoleon's movement, screened all visitors, censored mail and newspapers, and began cutting down the expenses allocated to maintain Longwood House. At a stormy interview on August 18, Napoleon told Lowe that his job was that of an executioner. "I have to obey my orders," the governor replied. "So, if you were ordered to assassinate me, you would obey?" Napoleon pressed. "No, the English are not assassins," Lowe shot back, and angrily rode away. The two never met again. All further communication between captive and keeper went through intermediaries. Bertrand became Napoleon's fiercest advocate. "Do you or do you not wish to kill the emperor?" he wrote to the governor. "If you persist in your conduct, you will have answered in the affirmative, and unhappily, the object will probably be obtained after some months' agony." Bertrand was referring to the restrictions on Napoleon's movement. But Napoleon himself had a darker fear. He became convinced he was being slowly destroyed by carefully administered poison. He complained to Dr. Barry O'Meara, the Irish physician who attended him after the surrender. Napoleon's health was unraveling. Gout prevented exercise. He was constantly cold, yet sunlight gave him headaches. His gums were sore and bled at the slightest touch. Napoleon believed Lowe managed to deceive emissaries from European powers about the true state of his health. When the governor learned that O'Meara was sending secret messages to Britain, he had the doctor dismissed in July 1818. Back home, O'Meara reported that Governor Lowe had spoken of the benefit which would result to Europe from the death of Napoleon. On August 15, 1819, Napoleon turned 50, but there was no celebration at Longwood. His entourage was shrinking. Among those who left was Count Monthalin's wife, who departed for Europe with her 3 children. The youngest, a daughter named Napoleon I, had been born on the island and was rumored to be the ex-emperor's child. Napoleon had grown fat, flabby, and depressed. He told Marquand he expected to die soon. A year after O'Meara's departure, Napoleon received a new private physician. Francesco Andamarchi, a young Corsican doctor, arrived on September 19, accompanied by 2 priests and a cook sent from Rome by Napoleon's uncle, Cardinal Fesch. Napoleon told Andamarchi his father had died of cancer and asked whether the disease was hereditary. Trying to calm his patient, the doctor prescribed gardening as exercise, and for a time Napoleon seemed improved. But on July 19, 1820, Andamarchi noted in his diary that Napoleon was suffering shivering, fever, pain in the head, nausea, dry and frequent coughing, and vomiting of a bilious quality. These symptoms marked the onset of the illness that would kill him 10 months later. Marquand recorded the decline in his memoirs, the very pages Verschaffvid would later study with such obsession. Combining Marquand's eyewitness account with earlier testimony, the Swedish toxicologist reconstructed the final illness in minute detail and claimed to find startling evidence of poisoning. Between March and May 1820, Napoleon was given a tartar emetic that could weaken the stomach, orgeat, a drink flavored with bitter almonds, and a strong dose of calomel, a drug that reacts fatally with bitter almonds. Verschaffvid argued this was a prelude to arsenic, the classic method of poisoning, he claimed, weakening the victim first, then killing in a way that leaves no trace of arsenic. Among his last wishes, Napoleon asked that his heart be removed before burial on St. Helena and sent to his wife, Marie-Louise, and that locks of his hair be given to various favorites. Governor Lowe denied the first request, but snippets of Napoleon's hair were preserved in several families, including the family of Louis Marquand. From Marquand's relic, Verschuffed obtained strands of hair which, when tested in 1960, revealed the presence of relatively large amounts of arsenic in Napoleon's body prior to death. It took him another 14 years to identify the assassin he believed responsible. The murderer, he claimed, was Count Montholin, acting on behalf of the Bourbon monarchy. At Longwood, Napoleon was served a South African wine imported in casks and bottled on Saint Helena, and crucially, only he drank this wine. As wine steward, Montholin kept the emperor's private supply under lock and offered a half bottle at each meal. On 2 occasions when the wine was mistakenly given to someone else, Verschuffed wrote, both recipients became ill. In 1840, with the Bourbons gone, France sent a delegation to Saint Helena to exhume Napoleon's body for return to Europe and ceremonial reburial in Paris. Most surviving members of the Exile entourage stood at graveside when the coffin was opened. Count Montholin was not among them. He had squandered his legacy from Napoleon and had been received in secret by King Charles X. By 1840, however, he had entered the service of Louis Napoleon, a nephew of the former emperor who would later rule France as Napoleon III. If Montholin had been on St. Helena when Napoleon's coffin was opened, Verschuffed suggested, he might have been stunned by what was seen. Though the clothing was in tatters, the body was remarkably well preserved. Would Montholin have known that arsenic can prevent decay, especially in a body exposed to chronic doses of poison? That question, hanging in the air between science and suspicion, is part of what keeps the story alive. Napoleon, the conqueror who could defeat armies, may have been undone not by a nation but by a glass poured at his own table.